For amusement, he set the dog on the beggar, but one word from her lips would soon bring the beast, and the men, to their knees. Marco Moretti stood on the terrace of his sprawling estate, a crystal tumbler of amber whiskey loose in his grip. Below him, the party raged on. It was a kaleidoscope of designer silk, spilled champagne, and hollow laughter. Politicians rubbed shoulders with hitmen, and models draped themselves over railings like expensive rugs. Marco hated every second of it. He was the king of this city, the men who controlled the docks, the unions, and the streets, yet he felt a profound, aching boredom that bordered on violence. His empire was vast, but his soul was a cavernous, empty room. "Boss," a voice cut through the noise. It was Luca, his head of security, looking uneasy. "We have a situation at the south gate." The sensors picked up movement. Marco turned, his dark eyes narrowing. A rival. No. A trespasser. A woman. She looks like a vagrant. Probably looking for scraps in the dumpsters near the kennels. The boys are ready to drag her out. Marco walked to the edge of the balcony and looked toward the shadowed perimeter of the estate. A cruel smile touched his lips. He did not want the boys to drag her out. He wanted to feel something. He wanted to see fear, raw and unfiltered, to cut through the numbness of the evening. "Leave her," Marco commanded, his voice a low rumble that made Luca flinch. "Release Titan." Luca's face went pale. "Titan? Boss, the dog has not been fed in 2 days. He's unstable. He'll tear her to pieces." "Did I ask for your opinion, Luca?" Marco finished his whiskey in one swallow and slammed the glass onto the stone railing. "I said, release him. Let the guests see what happens to those who trespass on Moretti land. It's time for a show." The order rippled through the security team. The music was lowered, not off, but to a simmering hum. Marco raised his hand, silencing the crowd below. He pointed toward the manicured lawn that stretched toward the kennel gates. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marco announced, his voice projecting with the charisma of a predator. "Tonight, we have a special demonstration of loyalty and power. Watch closely." The heavy iron gates of the kennel buzzed and clicked open. From the darkness, a low, mechanical growl emerged, followed by the sound of claws scraping against concrete. Titan appeared. He was a cane corso of nightmare proportions, 140 pounds of black muscle and scarred hide. Marco had spent thousands training the dog to be a weapon, a creature of pure hate. Titan did not have a master, he had a jailer. At the far end of the lawn, a small, hooded figure froze. She was draped in rags, layers of oversized gray fabric that swallowed her form. She stood near the rose bushes, a stark, dirty blot on the pristine landscape. Marco gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He expected the scream. He craved it. The moment Titan locked eyes on the intruder, the dog exploded into motion. It was a blur of violence, grass tearing under heavy paws, a black missile seeking heat and blood. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others leaning in with morbid fascination. "Run," Marco whispered to himself, a sadistic thrill curling in his gut. "Why do not you run?" But the figure did not move. She did not turn. She did not scream. She simply stood there, facing the charging death, as if she were waiting for a train rather than a monster. Marco's frown deepened. This was not part of the script. The prey was supposed to flee. The prey was supposed to break. The choice to release the dog was meant to assert his dominance, to remind everyone that he controlled life and death. But as the distance between the beast and the beggar closed, 50 yards, 30, 10, Marco felt a strange, cold prickle on the back of his neck. The woman's stillness was not born of paralysis. It was born of certainty. The collision should have been catastrophic. Titan was moving at full speed, his jaws parted, saliva flying in thick ropes, a growl tearing from his throat that sounded like tearing metal. Marco leaned over the balcony, his breath caught in his throat. 5 yards. The woman finally moved. She did not flinch away. She did not raise her arms to protect her face. She took a single step forward. Titan skidded. It was an impossible sight. The massive dog dug his claws into the turf, tearing up long strips of sod as he desperately tried to arrest his momentum. He slid, his heavy body twisting, dust kicking up in a cloud around them. He came to a halt inches from the woman's sturdy boots, his chest heaving, his flanks trembling with the exertion of the stop. The silence that fell over the estate was absolute. The music had died. The guests were statues. Marco felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a rhythmic thudding that drowned out the distant city sounds. What is this? Marco hissed, his hands gripping the stone railing so hard he felt the rough texture bite into his skin. Kill her. Titan. Ataka. His voice boomed across the lawn, the command that usually sent the dog into a frenzy. Titan's ears twitched. The dog looked up at the balcony, locking eyes with Marco. For the first time in 3 years, the dog's eyes did not hold the mindless rage Marco had cultivated. They held confusion. And something else. Defiance. Titan looked back at the woman. The beggar remained motionless, her face hidden deep within the cowl of her hood. She raised a hand, a slender, filthy hand wrapped in fingerless gloves, and slowly extended it toward the beast's muzzle. Do not touch him. Luca yelled from the ground level, his hand hovering over his holster. Take your arm off. Marco felt a surge of humiliated fury. His weapon was malfunctioning. His symbol of terror was being made a fool of by a vagrant. This was a disaster. If he could not control his dog, how could he control the families? How could he hold the city? He watched as the woman's fingers brushed the black velvet of Titan's nose. The dog did not snap. He did not bite. He let out a whine, a high, broken sound that had no place in the throat of a killer. Shoot it, Marco ordered, pushing off the balcony and storming toward the stairs. Shoot the dog. Shoot the woman. End this farce. Boss, wait. Luca shouted, but Marco was already descending the marble staircase, his Italian leather shoes slamming against the steps. He pulled a heavy silver semi-automatic from his jacket. He would do it himself. He would execute the dog for its failure and the woman for her insolence. He needed to re-establish order. He needed to wash away this embarrassment with blood. He marched onto the grass, the guests parting for him like the Red Sea, terror in their eyes. This was the Marco they knew. The butcher. He raised the gun as he approached the pair on the lawn. I gave you an order, you useless mutt, Marco snarled, aiming the barrel at Titan's broad skull. The dog looked at him, lips peeling back to reveal ivory fangs, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. But the growl was not directed at the woman. It was directed at Marco. The woman turned her head slightly. The hood obscured her features, but Marco felt the weight of her gaze. It was heavy, judgmental, and terrifyingly familiar. You have one chance, Marco spat at the woman, his finger tightening on the trigger. Step away from the animal, and I might make your death quick. Stay, and you both die in the dirt. The woman did not back down. Instead, she shifted her body, placing herself between the gun and the dog. She was protecting the beast. A beggar protecting a man-eater. The absurdity of it made Marco's hand shake. Who are you? Marco demanded, his voice cracking with a rage that masked a sudden, inexplicable fear. The woman inhaled sharply. Her voice, when it came, was raspy, and used, like a violin that had sat in a dusty case for years. But the tone, the cadence cut through Marco's soul like a serrated blade. You always were too quick to destroy what you could not understand, Marco. The gun did not fall from his hand, but his arm dropped as if the nerves had been severed. The world tilted on its axis. That voice. He had heard that voice in his dreams every night for 5 years. He had heard it in the wind, in the silence of his empty bedroom, in the bottom of every bottle. But he had buried it in a casket of ebony and gold. He had watched the earth cover it. No, Marco whispered, the color draining from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse standing upright. Impossible. The woman reached up with trembling hands and pulled back the hood of her rags. A collective gasp went through the crowd, but Marco heard none of it. He only saw her. Her hair, once a cascade of glossy raven silk, was chopped short and uneven, streaked with premature gray and dirt. Her face, the face that had been the sun in his dark universe, was changed. A jagged, silvery scar ran from her left temple, slicing through her eyebrow and down to her jawline. It was a mark of violence, of fire and glass. But the eyes, those haunting, emerald eyes, were the same. Elena. His Elena. The woman who had allegedly died in a car bombing meant for him 5 years ago. The woman whose body was burned beyond recognition. The woman he had mourned with a brutality that had turned him into a monster. Titan, Elena whispered, her eyes never leaving Marco's face. Jew. It was the command. Down. Not the harsh, shouted Italian commands the trainers used. It was the soft, loving command she used to use when Titan was just a clumsy, paw-heavy puppy she had insisted on keeping. The massive beast, the killer of men, the terror of the estate, immediately dropped his belly to the grass. He did not just lie down, he rested his heavy chin on her dirty boot and let out a long, shuddering sigh, closing his eyes as if he had finally come home after a long war. You re-dead, Marco choked out, taking a stumbling step backward. I buried you. I identified the ring on the finger. You buried a stranger, Elena said, her voice gaining strength, though tears welled in her eyes. You buried a poor girl who was in the wrong place when your enemies rigged the car. I was thrown clear. Broken. Burned. I woke up in a charity ward 3 weeks later with no name and a face even you would not love. Why? Marco's voice rose to a roar, a mix of agony and fury. Why did not you come back? I tore the world apart for you. I killed them all. Everyone who could have touched you, I slaughtered them. Look at you, Marco, she said, gesturing to the gun in his hand, to the terrified guests, to the opulent prison of his estate. Look at what you became. I watched you from the shadows. I wanted to come back. God, I wanted to come back every day. But then I saw the news. The bodies. The cruelty. You did not just grieve me, Marco. You used my death as an excuse to unleash the darkness I spent years trying to keep at bay. She looked down at the dog, stroking his scarred ears. And then I heard about Titan. I heard how you beat him. How you starved him to make him mean. How you turned the only living thing we raised together into a weapon. She looked up, her gaze hardening into steel. That was when I knew the Marco I loved was truly dead. I did not come back for you tonight, Marco. I came for him. I came to save the dog before you turned him into a monster like yourself. The accusation hit Marco harder than a bullet. He looked at Titan, the dog he had kicked, the dog he had isolated, the dog he had treated as a tool of intimidation. The dog was currently pressing his body against Elena's legs, desperate for the love Marco had denied him for 5 years. He is mine, Marco snarled, trying to regain the scraps of his authority. You are mine. He raised the gun again, though his aim wavered. He did not know what he was doing. He was drowning in a storm of emotions he could not process. Panic. Relief. Guilt. And a defensive, toxic possessiveness. You do not get to leave. You do not get to walk in here and judge me. I did this for you. Every drop of blood was for you. Titan, Elena said softly. Guard. The change was instantaneous. The dog did not growl. He did not bark. He simply rose from the ground and placed himself directly between Elena and Marco. He stood tall, his chest expanded, his eyes locked on Marco's weapon. He was not aggressive, he was immovable. A shield. The dog was choosing. And he was not choosing the master who fed him steak and gave him a heated kennel. He was choosing the hand that had once scratched his belly and whispered lullabies. He was choosing love over fear. Marco stared at the tableau before him. His resurrected bride, scarred and broken, standing behind his beast, who was ready to die to protect her from him. The realization cracked through the ice around his heart, shattering it completely. He looked at the gun in his hand. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, heavy and cold. It was the only thing he had trusted for 5 years. It was the only way he knew how to communicate with the world. And right now, it was the most useless object in the universe. The guests were whispering. Luca was gesturing for the snipers on the roof to take aim. They were waiting for Marco's signal to drop the dog, to secure the woman. They thought this was a hostage situation. They did not understand that Marco was the hostage. He was a prisoner of his own grief and rage. "Stand down!" Marco shouted at the rooftops, his voice cracking. "Stand down, all of you! Get out! Everyone out!" He turned to the crowd of gawkers. "Leave. Now. Before I burn this whole place to the ground with you in it." The panic was immediate. The herd mentality took over, and the elite of the city scrambled for their limousines, dropping glasses and purses in their haste. Within minutes, the driveway was a jam of taillights. Luca hesitated, looking from Marco to the woman. "Go, Luca," Marco said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Leave us." "But boss." "Go." When the last car had faded and the security team had retreated to the perimeter, silence reclaimed the garden. The moonlight washed over the grass, turning the blood-red roses into black velvet. Marco looked at Elena. He looked at the scar that marred her beautiful face. He had done that. Indirectly, his life, his choices, his war had carved that line into her skin. And then, for 5 years, his cruelty had kept her away. She had feared him more than she feared poverty. He looked at Titan. The dog was still tense, ready to spring. The animal saw him as a threat. And the animal was right. "You rewrite," Marco said, his voice trembling. He opened his hand. The silver gun fell to the grass with a dull thud. Titan's ears flicked, but he did not move. Marco took a step forward, and Titan growled. It was a warning. "Stay back." "I'm sorry," Marco choked out. Tears, hot and foreign, spilled over his cheeks. He sank to his knees. The ruthless Mafia Don, the men who made mayors tremble, collapsed onto the manicured turf. He did not kneel in prayer. He knelt in submission. He bowed his head, exposing his neck, surrendering completely. "I'm sorry," he repeated, sobbing into the silence. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I'm sorry, Titan." He waited for the bite. He waited for Elena to leave. He waited for the end. Instead, he heard the crunch of dry grass. He heard the soft huff of dog breath. And then, he felt it. A wet, rough tongue dragged across his tear-streaked cheek. Titan. The dog had closed the distance, not to kill, but to comfort. Marco looked up. Elena was standing over him. She was not smiling, there was too much pain between them for smiles. But the hardness in her eyes had softened. She reached out, her hand hovering over his head, before finally, gently, weaving her fingers into his hair. "You have a lot to answer for, Marco," she said, her voice stern but laced with a fragile hope. "You have a lot to fix." Marco grabbed her hand, pressing his face into her rough, dirty palm, kissing the scars on her knuckles. He wrapped his other arm around Titan's thick neck, burying his face in the fur of the beast he had tormented. "Anything," Marco wept, clutching them both as if they were the only solid things in a dissolving world. "I'll burn it all down. I'll give it all up. Just do not leave me again." "We are not leaving," Elena said quietly, looking at the empty mansion that loomed like a tomb behind them. "But the beast does not live in the cage anymore, Marco. And neither do you." Under the cold moonlight, the king of the city remained on his knees, holding the 2 souls he had almost destroyed, knowing that the man he was 10 minutes ago was dead, and the man he needed to become had just taken his first, painful breath.